Well, hello everyone, and today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're planning for Rationally Centered to start to do a series of interviews of different people who have unique philosophies or ideologies that they subscribe to. And the goal is not to be a hit job, but really to help everyone kind of understand different groups a little bit better and ideally see that they're not quite as monstrous or horrible as some people might think. So the first one we're going to kick off with is Vinny Grindell, who is a MGTOW, but one who is at least at minimum open to talking to a feminist. So I'd say that's a win. And we're going to talk a little bit about the philosophy in general, as well as his particular experiences for how he came around to MGTOW. And lastly, kind of try to understand if there's any points of collaboration between the two, so they don't have to be constantly, at odds with each other. Thanks, Vinny, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd love it if first you could just give kind of a brief overview of what the MGTOW philosophy is for people who aren't quite familiar with it.
Sure. It stands for Men Going Their Own Way. Excuse my voice. I've got a little bit of a cold. But it stands for Men Going Their Own Way. For me, it's very individualistic. It means different things for different people. But for me, it basically just means not letting somebody else have agency or control over the decisions you make in your life. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of that is some, where women kind of play into that is the state of the dating and modern, the modern dating scene and marriage and things like that. It's just become, and it's not very conducive to going my own way. You lose a lot of your freedom when you're in those situations. And to me, it just doesn't seem worth the risk. To me, it fails a risk reward analysis. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? It outweighs the reward when it comes to situations like that. And it isn't just about hating, hating women or anything like that. Like some of them do. And I speak out against that whenever I can, but I don't. To me, it's more about having personal freedom and personal responsibility and taking accountability for the things that you do and your actions, and working to better yourself for yourself and not for anybody else, and not subscribing to what other people think you need to do. I don't know if that's a pretty good explanation, I think.
Oh, gotcha. I think that makes, certainly sense and is very coherent and consistent, at least from the beginning. And it seems like MGTOW members or individuals have a pretty diverse set of reasons for justifying their opinions on women that range from biblical to science to just entirely subjective personal experiences. Could you kind of elaborate on each of those and how logical or illogical you think those attitudes are?
Sure. There are a lot of people that maybe they'll see like a relative or a friend or several friends in some cases just absolutely demolished by the divorce court system and the family court system. And, those people will see that and say, I'm not going to be that guy. And maybe some of the more vocal, angrier ones are usually people that have been put through the ringer by the divorce court system. And, I can kind of understand their rage, but at the same time, it's like you have to move on. At some point, there has to be, you're not going your own way if you're just sitting there screaming at the walls all day. To me, it doesn't make sense. I don't know if that makes sense but there are people that there's those people, and then there are the people that just, I don't know, they don't like women. And I'm not a fan of them myself. Like I said, I speak out against that every chance I get. And I think a lot of them use the red pill rage, label, I guess, as like a shield. Mm-hmm. Or like as a weapon when they're supposed to be using it as a shield. You know what I mean? There's a lot of that going on both sides, I guess. And It's kind of represents a failure to acknowledge that evil is the least sexist thing on earth. You know, and I think there's a lot of that on both sides, and that should be acknowledged. Yeah, so that's essentially the gist of why a lot of people go MGTOW, is because they see a lot of things. And for me, it was just purely mathematics. You know, when you look at the failure rates of marriages and the rate at which the divorces don't go the way of men, it's a sucker's bet. I was raised in a pretty gambling friendly family. I was taught to gamble at a very young age. Like, it was never a problem for anybody, but one of the first things I was taught was never to gamble with your life and never to gamble with something you can't afford to lose. And to me, half is something I can't afford to lose. So it's just not worth the gamble to me. Some people look at it from that aspect. Some people go, I call it the emotional aspect, where they've been, you know, just ruined. But yeah, that's essentially the gist of that.
And it seems like MGTOW emphasizes a lot of different concepts like hypergamy and gynocentric, androcentric. All those words might have been mispronounced, so I apologize. Could you elaborate a little bit more on each of those elements and how they kind of fit into the MGTOW philosophy?
Sure. Hypergamy is the, I guess you would call it marrying up. And it's like it's a unique biological trait to women. And it had a very practical purpose tens of thousands of years ago, because obviously when it came to mate selection, you wanted to select the biggest, strongest, most successful men, because you wanted to breed, you know, survival of the fittest. And in today's day and age, I don't really think that's needed anymore. And it seems like it's been encouraged and it's run rampant. We have what's called the 80-20 rule. And that is, a society starts to degrade when 80% of the men are sleeping with 20% of the women. And it starts to, I don't know if I'm saying it right, but the 80-20 rule is a thing among the red pill community. It's actually kind of debated. It's a natural function of biology, I think, and I don't think it's ever something we're going to get rid of. But I think that traditionalism in the 50s definitely kept it in check, so to speak. And see, my personal opinion is, I feel this was all started by no-fault divorce. Completely ruined marriage for everybody. And it turned it into just this rampant exercise in hypergamy. And I don't think it's the fault of feminism or the fault of like women in general. It's just how it happened. You know, society had a hand in it. Men had a hand in it. You know, and the other one was gynocentrism, you had said, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of that term because it sounds way too much like patriarchy. You know, it sounds like the other side of that coin. But there's some validity to that. I mean, if you look at criminal sentences, like, I don't know if you're familiar with the Lavina Woodward case at all.
The one in England?
Yeah. She stabbed her husband with a bread knife and threw a jam jar and a laptop at him and got no prison time. Well, it was suspended. You know, had the gender roles been reversed, that dude would rightfully be in jail for a few years. You know, and you see a lot of that stuff, and it's pretty compelling evidence for gynocentric theory. I just can't get on board with something that sounds so much like patriarchy. I don't know. I'm an egalitarian. I'm not necessarily a traditionalist. So
yeah, and I do think that at least some of the arguments behind that, at least in my opinion, tend to be a little bit cherry-picked, as certainly that case was an outlier that I feel like was denounced by feminists and non-feminists alike because it doesn't jive with our perspective. And there certainly are elements like the fact that marital rape was not illegal until, you know, 1993. There's lots of particularly athletes and other high-profile cases where men who beat their wives or rape people kind of don't get the punishment. So I think there are always going to be inconsistencies in the legal system, but I share your perspective that we shouldn't draw conclusions that that means the entire system as a whole is kind of too slanted towards women.
Well, I mean, in today's day and age, we bury rapists under the jail, you know, as we should. And, you know, when you look at the crime statistics, that when you factor in past convictions and criminal history and all of these things, you see that women as a whole get, I think it's like 33% of a man's sentence, like generally, and they're several times more likely to escape jail. I mean, when you hear these things, it's really compelling evidence for something that would be what they would call gynocentrism. I think we should come up with another term for it. You know, but there's really compelling evidence for it, and it's hard to deny the evidence when you look at the crime numbers and you look at the data on all of it. It's really hard to deny for me.
And how do you kind of balance that with the fact that women weren't allowed to vote in kind of like the past little bit over 100 years, and women weren't allowed to have equal pay for equal work? Because I think, at least in my opinion, when you kind of view it in context, it feels more like people maybe put women on a pedestal where they, when they're violent, kind of don't see them as impactful or deserving to be punished, but it's still in the broader context of men having the power and just kind of selecting to, in certain spheres, not punish women as heavily or see them as violent. So I'm not sure if that's, I think that both of those things can in some sense be true, and one's kind of more based on power and the other one more based on gender roles. I'm kind of curious if you agree.
Well, men are definitely at fault for some of that as well, for kind of allowing it to happen and buying into, you know, I call it the sugar, spice, and everything nice narrative. And it's this inability to reconcile such evil with, you know, the beautiful woman standing in front of you. Like, for example, the Casey Anthony case. Like, I mean, it was plainly obvious that she did it. And the judge just couldn't reconcile the fact that this beautiful young lady standing in front of him could have committed such a heinous crime. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, no, I mean, evil exists in, you know, you see a lot of times cases like that where she'll go out and party all weekend and not call the cops, and, you know, everything points to like absolutely guilty, and she manages to woo the judge and seduce her lawyer and get out of the trial. And it was just amazing to me. But I mean, these are individual cases, but when you look at the grand crime statistics across the board, there's definitely a pattern there. And I don't think correlation and causality, you know, correlation doesn't always imply causality, but when the correlation's this strong, it's hard to deny. It really is. As far as women not getting the vote, I actually believe that any citizen of this country should have the right to vote. That's just my personal opinion. Any human being that is a citizen of this country should have the right to vote. But if you look at the years before the suffragettes started, they didn't want the vote. A vast majority of the women during that time wanted nothing to do with the vote. They were confident that their husbands would vote in their stead. They wanted nothing to do with registering for the draft. And it was only when it was said that there was going to be no draft for vote really took off. And I think that's kind of telling in some ways.
Yeah, no, I definitely think, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, no, I think those are definitely fair points. And the position of the draft, I think it is interesting how a lot of people focus on the attitudes of women before World War I, while at least in my perspective, basically every feminist today is for both men and women qualifying for the draft. And it's really, at least from personal conversations, men who feel uncomfortable, again, because of that sort of pedestal of women as weaker and less able to contribute. And I think it's just important to recognize that back in 1910, a lot of things were sort of fucked up. Like, people also believed in radical racism, you know, they believed in sexism in all sorts of categories, but it's so important to understand the historical context, so I think that makes sense. And then I wanted to kind of go back to what you were talking about in terms of women's genetic predisposition.
Sure.
You talked about kind of the survival of the fittest aspect, but I think that, or I'm kind of curious why that's only kind of a female gene, because I think if you're trying to, you know, breed the best children, there'd be an element of men as well trying to sort of focus on the women that can pass along the best genes. And I also wanted to know, for the concept of marrying up, do you think that the same concept applies to men, and like men trying to find the most attractive women, which I think again is a small subset of women that exist. So while you kind of see that women focus on, you know, the strongest men, I think women sort of see the opposite, that men really have high expectations of women's looks as well as women's behavior, and if they don't meet those requirements, are disinclined to sort of pursue them.
Well, I think that's just part of the narrative, so to speak, where women went after the biggest, strongest, most successful men, and men fought to be the biggest, strongest, successful man to get the girl, so to speak. And I think that's where a lot of, you know, the testosterone and the competitiveness and all of the things that you see that are biologically male traits, that's what served us so well then, because we knew that if we were the smartest, richest, most successful people, we would get the best quality women, so to speak. And, you know, that's the definition of strong, powerful, and successful has changed over the years. And now it's more the most successful guys. Like Warren Farrell put it really well in his book, The Myth of Male Power, where it said, women have historically been viewed as sex objects, and men have historically been viewed as success objects. It's a very, very compelling point. It's a great claim, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. And you know, is either one of them right? I mean, you could debate that forever, but it's just is. There's rights and wrongs and all of it. It's, to me, that's the only explanation you can give, is it just is. And it's always been that way. And it's served us well. I mean, there's 9 billion of us on the planet now. So I don't know.
Yeah.
That's go ahead.
The one question is, would you at least say, though, that the ability to be successful is something that can be sort of achieved through hard work, while the ability to be attractive and sexually appealing is something that's more sort of set in stone? So men have a lot more autonomy to sort of or be effective and attractive to women, while women really are locked into characteristics that are sort of beyond their control.
To an extent. I mean, if you look at Tinder and all those dating sites, a lot of times I do see a lot of women that'll post like, I won't date a man that is, you know, or things like that.
But so would men date a woman who's 5'11"?
Absolutely. I've dated women that were like 5'2", and I'm 6'2".
No, short's good. I was saying taller than them, because kind of like women have a bias against men who are shorter, but I was just kind of curious if you think that bias cuts both ways.
I don't understand why. I think taller women are kind of hot, to be honest.
So like a 6'4" would be kind of right up your alley.
I'm sorry?
So a 6'4" woman would be sort of right up your alley if you're 6'2"?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I would date a woman that was taller than me. But I kind of find like really smart, talented women to be kind of sexy in a way. So I guess I'm different in that way. But yeah, I find that to be very attractive when a woman can like stand on her own 2 feet and do her thing. Drawn to that. Even as a MGTOW, I'm drawn to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways it's not entirely bad that levels of attraction have evolved over time, because I think the way it was before was entirely shallow, of men kind of being valuable for being strong and women sort of being valuable for, you know, being hot and having childbearing hips. And now at least we've kind of evolved a little bit to focusing on personality over just physical strength and attraction. So while I see that it's frustrating, particularly for people who aren't super successful or super intelligent kind of on both sides, I think that sometimes people are a little bit too black and white in saying that the way we've evolved is worse. And that kind of leads into my next question of, what do you think are the problems of relationships today that kind of make men be so inclined to do MGTOW, to start beyond the legal element of divorce? And what do you think kind of an ideal, healthy sexual relationship would look like?
It's become, to me, it's like the sword of Damocles. In some situations, like I myself am one of the MGTOW that I believe you can actually date as long as you don't live in the same house. That's where it gets kind of dangerous, because if there was a bad situation and it was to go bad, the guy is going to be the one that ends up packing his stuff and leaving and having to find a place to live a vast majority of the time. And that's, I've done that far too many times to have to, I don't want to keep doing that, you know? And to me, it's that's the danger of it, is once you move in with somebody and enter into a relationship like that, you've surrendered a lot of your agency. You know, she can kick you out anytime she wants. And, you know, no matter what, the state will blame you for it. The state will kick you out and they will blame you for it. They'll send the police and you'll be the one that leaves. And to me, it just seems like we've overshot gender equality by quite a ways in that sense. And to me, going MGTOW is just a protest of that. And
that sounds like that's sort of like the bad elements, but what would a good relationship look like? One that, because, you know, 50% of relationships end in divorce, although I think that number has been decreasing recently. I'm not sure the latest stat, but, you know, the other ones don't. So I'd love to hear, like, what kind of relationship would be positive for MGTOW, if at all, if you think that it's kind of impossible for us to fulfill sort of the ideal of a positive relationship, that's fine too.
Sure. I'd actually like to go back to the first point of that after, but a good relationship, a lot of people say a relationship is a joining of, you know, two forces, like, you know, like a convoy of two wagons heading down the same path, or coming into one big covered wagon heading down the same trail. To me, a good relationship would be, to use that metaphor, like, wouldn't two carts be faster because there's twice the horses? And, you know, I keep my stuff, you keep your stuff, but we have our stuff together, you know. Well, there has to be a give and take there. There has to be a 50-50 there, to me, to be an ideal relationship. That's what I would look for if I was looking. And I'm sorry, your first point, you had said
I'm not sure what the first point was, to be honest. Probably, thank God we like dodged a bullet of that horrible point that we'll both just not remember.
Exactly.
And so you kind of like talk about sort of an ideal relationship being one where the man and woman are equal and kind of progressing together and respecting each other. Do you think for your, if you don't mind a more personal question, for your past relationships, was it a situation where you thought the woman was like that and she kind of tricked you or evolved, which made it not work out? Or do you think that some of the burden and responsibility is sort of on you for not selecting the type of women that are actually consistent with what you think is the right type of woman for a healthy relationship?
That was pretty much my first and only marriage to a T. We were high school sweethearts. I married her. We actually ended up, she moved to another town for a long time, and when she came back, we ended up meeting up again, and we ended up getting married. And 2 years into the marriage, she left me for a friend of mine that I had been friends with for a very long time. And the reason she gave to her friends was because he made $100,000 a year. And that was a real eye opener for me. That was kind of my red pill moment, because I was in a really dark place. You know, oh, it was bad. It was like The Wedding Singer. I was on the couch. It was bad. And one of my buddies showed up, and he's a pretty big dude. And he was like, "You're coming with me to play disc golf today." And I was like, "I don't know how to play," and he was like, "No, you're coming. Like, if I have to drag you, you're coming." So I ended up doing that, and that became like my outlet, but I was in a really, really dark place because of that. Like, it bad. I was, there were times where I just thought it would be so much easier if this just ended, and I'm sure every guy that's been through a pretty horrific divorce has thought about that, but obviously I'm glad I didn't. But you end up in a really, really dark place, and I wouldn't wish that on anybody. And I think that's my major objection to marriage, is I don't want to ever go through that again. And sometimes, not all women are like that. That's a really common thing. We even have an acronym for it, NOWALT.
Yeah, I think it's pretty lame. Well, because is there like a not all conservatives are like that, not all MGTOWs
right.
that, not all. I mean, you can really kind of, it's like, yes, like humans are humans. So not all,
right.
Any category is any category. But, you do you. I know that, acronyms are really hot right now. So I'm not here.
I'm wary of anyone who makes all statements, to be honest. But yeah, like for me, it wasn't not all women are like that. It was, they've all got the ability, inclined to be bad, to be like that. They could very easily do it. And with the help of the state that I pay taxes to, it's just an unbelievable thing for me that people still actually do this, that men still actually get married. And I do feel like if no man got married for a couple of years, the institution would have to change, or it would collapse. And I think that's MGTOW is men getting to that point where it's like, well, we'll let this whole thing collapse if that's what it takes. And I think some people would say that's kind of a nihilistic view, but I feel like a lot of times I watch MRAs and it seems to me like they're yelling at brick walls, and it's just like, there's no point in even arguing anymore. Just let the house of cards fall and we'll rebuild it from there.
Yeah. Do you think that women should be taking the same attitude, given all men also have the potential to be violent or, disrespect them? Just, like marriage in general kind of is a compromise where both sides are sort of taking risks. And so, yeah, A, do you think that women should be making the same decision men are? And B, do you think that that's really even possible on a large scale when, at least in theory, it sounds like MGTOW believe in biological urges, but there is sort of a biological urge or necessity to kind of have a match and build a life. I don't think it's required by any means, but I think for a lot of people, it's kind of a key part of their goal set.
Well, I think as far as I think the big difference is when men abuse their wives, they are and should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Generally, on a very general sense, I would say upwards of 90% with today's laws are fully prosecuted and do their time, and as they should. I don't condone abuse in any relationship for anybody. But I think that's the major difference, is that you don't hear about women getting prosecuted for the things they do to men in family and divorce court. They generally walk out of that with child support and alimony, and it's like the cash and prizes. Whereas an abusive man gets arrested, as he should, and goes to jail, as he should. The major difference as far as A. And B, what was B?
Is it possible for people on a large scale to kind of opt out of the process of serious relationships or marriage, etc.?
Oh, definitely. It's actually happening currently in Japan. I don't know if you've heard of this. They're called grass eaters in Japan, but they have a negative birth rate right now because so many of them are refusing to get married, refusing to have kids, and I guess it's become a problem, and people are starting to talk about it. People are starting to get scared because I don't know how many generations, but they said at the rate that they're going, in several generations down the road, they run a real serious risk of being extinct. And that's scary. That is really scary. Even as a MGTOW, like, I don't want to see any race go extinct. But drastic situations sometimes require drastic measures, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think that kind of the situation in Japan and just gender relations in general in other countries, I think could be a video of its own. Kind of like from,
right.
Yeah, I'll actually hold off on what I know about Japan because it's still pretty shallow, but that's a good suggestion to kind of dive into for a future video. It also sort of sounds
Sure.
like a lot of you sort of recognize that both men and women can be selfish, or potentially violent. I kind of disagree about the 90%, but we can kind of like put a pin in that since there is a lot of back and forth about percentages. And so it really sounds like it's more the legal barriers that make you so hesitant to kind of commit to a relationship and marriage again. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about what specific legal changes you recommend, and as well as if those changes happened, do you think being a MGTOW would be less necessary? And why do you think men are currently so ineffective at getting those changes to occur, given men still are the majority of politicians, judges, lawyers, half the population in general? I do agree. I think that MRAs have made a good point that men theoretically make the laws, but women really lobby for it. But I still think just from like a power dynamic, if it's unfair to men, they do have all the tools at their disposal to make changes. So why aren't they?
The first thing I would do is I would abolish no-fault divorce. I would get rid of that completely, because when somebody signs a marital contract, it's a lifetime contract, and people need to realize the gravity of that. And if you're not willing to make that kind of commitment, then don't get married. And if you sign that contract, then you better honor it. That's just the way I've been brought up, is your name is the most important thing that you could ever preserve, the integrity of your name. And as soon as you put your name on that contract, you're bound to it. You can't just back out whenever you want. There has to be fault. And I think that would balance a lot of the alimony cases and all of those things. It would balance a lot of that out, because when you can prove fault, the other person usually got, the quote unquote cash and prizes for like compensation, And as far as the politicians go, a lot of the politicians are men, and I think that touches on men's portion of the blame for this whole situation. A lot of them buy into the sugar, spice, and everything nice narrative. And I think men kind of did prop up civilization for a long time, but I think the reason they did it was like paying tribute to women, because historically women were the creators of life, and that's an amazing thing. Cassie J said in a TED Talk, and it was a great thing, that it's no less sexist to say that men built just about everything you see around you than it is to say women created every human there is around you. You know, neither one of those are sexist statements. They're both just incredible things that men and women can do. You know, and they complement each other. You know, I kind of went off on a tangent, but that's a lot of the reasons why that's kind of the accountability on men. Accountability on men is that they bought into the whole sugar spice and everything nice thing and can't reconcile that there, and that when you pass laws like this, they become really easy to exploit. And to think that
sorry, there's just a little bit of noise out there from my boyfriend, so want to make sure
that's all right. And to think that, you know, no woman on earth is intelligent enough to use these shields as weapons, you know, is just ridiculous. It's patronizing, you know, to think that, oh, well, she won't ever figure out how to do that. It's like, well, yeah, she will. She's a human just like you know. They have brains too. And brains can be used for good and nefarious purposes. And, you know, when you have a system that is that, it essentially encourages women to divorce their husbands. When I was going through, my son's mother had applied for TANF, the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, and I went to this class. In the class, but I was angry when I left that class, because the whole class was them telling these women how to get more money from the state. Like, well, just tell them this and you'll get money longer. Well, just tell them this and you'll get money longer. Instead of enroll in college, you know, further your education, better yourself, and you won't need us anymore. You know, the government kind of bred this whole like dependence thing. And I really don't like it. They've encouraged people to become dependent on the state. They've encouraged single mothers to replace fathers with the state. And it's disastrous. It's just been absolutely disastrous, especially to like the inner city Black community has just been decimated by the government stepping in that manner. And it's quite sad to watch, really.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. For one point you said earlier about not being sexist, to say that men kind of like created a lot of the success in the world and women really created all the success of birthing children. I think that's true, but I think what a lot of feminists do find sexist is the attitude that men were the only people capable of making all of those economic achievements. I think that, to your point, women are people too. We kind of both saw historically how there are a lot less female leaders, but the ones we have, like Queen Elizabeth, Catherine the Great, Golda Meir, Margaret Thatcher, were actually, especially given what a small sample size we have, like really outperforming a lot of their male counterparts. So I think it's interesting how, on one hand, men seem to have this attitude that women do kind of have a ceiling for how successful they can be, which sort of feeds why they push women towards a welfare state and relying on their husband. But on the other side, they sort of complain about those dynamics. And the other question I had for you, as you kind of talked about the challenges in the inner cities, is that I think, and again, you can sort of like debate which is more harmful, but a lot of reasons why the family dynamic has been so poor there haven't really been the choice of the woman. There are a lot of people that, for a lot of reasons, including institutional racism, a lot of men are in jail. A lot of men who aren't in jail don't want to support their kids, kind of like aren't really kind of like paying the child support they need. And so I'm kind of curious, how do you think that plays in? Do you think those men are right to do so? And as part of that, there's a concept, I can't remember the name, but something where men want to be able to like release their parental rights if they don't want to have the child, which again, I think has interesting dynamics in terms of personal responsibility. So curious on your take of all that.
You had said, I don't think that the problem in the inner cities is a race problem per se. I think it's more of a cultural problem. And there are a lot, I mean, there are definitely men in those environments that are just douchebags, you know, that just don't want to raise their kids. They have a bunch of kids and want nothing to do with them. I don't condone that. I think if you get somebody pregnant, that becomes your responsibility. I mean, I have a son. I couldn't imagine not being in my son's life. I couldn't, because it's my responsibility. As you know, I mean, I got her pregnant, so I have to face the music, you know. Excuse me. And your other thing was, I'm sorry, what else was there? There was a lot there.
So there was, do you think that there's an attitude of women being less capable that kind of causes that, like, welfare state and sort of like pushing them, you know, pushing housewives, which then makes them less kind of effective from an income generation standpoint, and then just in general kind of has the more patronizing perspective on women's capabilities?
Not anymore. I don't think so. I don't think so at all. I think there was definitely a clear case for that in like the 40s and 50s, you know, way back when, but today, no, not at all. I think if a woman is fully capable of doing the job, she's going to get the job over a less capable man anytime. And it may just be me being naive, but I would like to think that that's the case. You know, I'm a firm believer in a meritocracy. I think the right person for the job should get the job. And I think that their gender, race, religion, anything is completely irrelevant. And I don't know. I feel like I don't feel like there's any of that today. And if there is, it's isolated pockets of idiocy that nobody really listens to anyway, like the Richard Spencers of the world.
Yep. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. So as we sort of tie things up a bit, I'm kind of curious, you talked about a lot of reasons why you are MGTOW, or a lot of challenges you think men face today. If the legal element was sort of implemented in the way that you want in terms of reevaluating divorce and men's financial expectations, do you think you'd still be a MGTOW, or would that risk-reward calculus really evolve?
Me personally, yes, I still would be. My trust in the marriage institution has been irrevocably, I don't know how to say that word, broken. I have zero trust in the institution now, and I have zero desire to go through it again. I don't think, you know, and that sounds kind of dogmatic, but I just, to me, there's just nothing for me there. I've already folded my chips and left that table, so to speak, and I'm somewhere else now. I'm not even in the room anymore.
Gotcha. No, I think that makes sense, and each person certainly has their own philosophy and decision making that they would do. And then the last question on my end is external to the legal aspect. Are there any examples of sexism that you think still exist for women, or I guess for men? And kind of what responsibility do you think both feminists and MGTOW have to address those issues, either together or separately?
I definitely think both exist. I think the difference is a lot of the things you see that are sexist against men tend to be shared, encouraged. Like if you go on sites like Vice and you type in white people, just the results are horrific. You type in men on BuzzFeed and some of the articles are just gross. You know, blatant. There's a lot of pretty blatant sexism out there. And, you know, I think a lot of men won't say anything about it because they're afraid to be, you know, shamed or whatever. And that's one of the good things about being MGTOW is you don't have any shame anymore. And I do think that there are some instances of there's some pretty blatant sexism against women, and they should be called out, obviously, whenever they happen on both sides. And yeah, I guess that's where I stand on that, is they should definitely be called out if it's there. If it's blatant sexism, it should be called out. But we have to define our terms. Like, what would you define as sexist? You know, what one person would define as sexist, what one woman would define as sexist, another might find hilarious. You know what I'm saying? And I think a lot of the feminist MRA argument is largely that nobody really clearly defines their terms. You know, how do you define oppression? How do you define, in a traditional marriage, who's really oppressed in that situation? You know, it would depend on the perspective of each person. I don't know. Are you following me?
Oh yeah, no, I'm definitely following. We're just kind of waiting for the wrap. I think that's a very fair point. That kind of the inconsistencies with how people define that can be really challenging.
And I think a lot of that, it's, you know, it's like that with a lot of the terms that both feminism and MRAs use, is they don't clearly define what they mean. You know, and they're using terms like oppression. It's a really relative term. It's in the eye of the beholder. You know, going back to my traditional marriage thing, the single mother the married wife that stays at home with 3 children and is a homemaker and takes care of the kids and does all those things might feel like she's oppressed. But her husband, the coal miner that goes and mines coal for somebody else for 12 hours a day and comes home beaten up and exhausted, you know, so he can make the home for his wife, he might think he's oppressed, and he might think she enjoys a level of freedom he'd never see. It's all relative. It really is.
Yeah, no, I think those are interesting thoughts across the board. And kind of the one last thing based on some of what you just shared, you mentioned how you feel like MGTOW have no shame, but I think there is the way they act that might be inconsistent with that. From what I understand, a lot of them sort of hide their face and are reluctant to share their identity. What do you think the reasons are for that, and how, if at all, do you think that can change?
I think because the term has a lot of negative connotations around it. And I do, you do have a valid point. I do think it's kind of funny that some of them, they'll call themselves MGTOW and they just sit there and talk about women all the time. And, you know, they questions them, they get really, really defensive. And, you know, it's like, to me, that's not really going your own way. I don't really feel any shame for it. And, you know, those attempts actually make me laugh more than anything, because it's like, that's cute, you know. But I do see a lot of that, and I think it's just as ridiculous as you do. And some of the guys that hide their face, I think it's more for like security reasons. Some of those guys might get some threats, you know, maybe some things of that nature. Like, the internet's a pretty messed up place. I don't really have any fear of that, because I'm very pro Second Amendment.
Gotcha.
But I don't really, you know, so I have no problem showing my face, and I don't really think I say anything that's particularly inflammatory. So I think the really inflammatory ones hide their face, because I think there's a part of them that knows that what they're saying is really inflammatory and isn't, you know, it's gasoline for the fire. I think that's why a lot of them hide their face.
Gotcha. No, I think that makes sense.
Some of them,
well,
I'm sorry. Some of them, I think that they just hide their face for the anonymity factor, for like the air of mystery. You know, like Stardust, for instance. He doesn't say anything particularly inflammatory, but I've never seen his face once. So I don't know. I guess it's different for each person.
Gotcha. No, I think that makes sense. Terrific. Well, I think that kind of covers all of my thoughts. I think it was really helpful. Like, I learned a lot, and hopefully the people watching did as well, about how the MGTOW philosophy works with a real example. Any last words you want to add on your end?
follow me on YouTube, Vinny Grandel. Subscribe, hit buttons.
Yep.
I got a bunch of other shows.
And so everyone is definitely highly encouraged to subscribe to Vinny's YouTube channel.
I do some non-MGTOW stuff too. I'm actually a gamer, so I do some gamer stuff. So yeah, if you're into that stuff, definitely follow me and hit buttons. That's what I usually say. So
cool. Terrific. All right. Thanks again. And thank you all for watching. Looking forward to your thoughts on this video and ones in the future.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for joining.